Well, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Ko katihi o ka hukura te maunga, ko Aopawaho te awa no Aotearoa aho. Ko mori taku papa, ko rei taku mama. Ko Jane taku hoa rangatira. Ko Derek Wenmoth taku ingoa, tēnā koutou. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou. I've just introduced myself in the way that if you were to visit New Zealand, you would be introduced to a group as you visit. Those who visited New Zealand had the opportunity to visit a number of schools, and when they visited those schools, in many of those places, we were visited, or at least greeted, with what was called a mihi whakatau. And what I did then was give you my mihi. I'm just seeing if it came up on the stage, so you can see. It's a bit of an abbreviated version, but there's a purpose in doing it. And I haven't done it today to simply sort of show off a little bit of the Maori language, but because there's significance and meaning when people from one place meet people from another place. And I guess reflecting a little bit on what we heard in the first keynote this morning reminded me a lot about identity. Knowing who we are is important as educators, and knowing who it is that we're dealing with on the other side is important. So as two groups come together on a marae in New Zealand, this is what would happen. They would take turns in introducing themselves. And in introducing themselves, they'd introduce themselves in terms of the place that they are from, so that you get a sense of both their personal journey and their personal history. So for me, there's the world. I've had to travel 27 hours to get here. Right? So that will have different connotations and different meanings for different people. 12,000 kilometres, quite a long way. It's interesting when you compare that with the fact that it's closer for me to get to a place like China than it is to come here to Arkansas. All right? And that's significant because that little circle that I've put on the map there is important when we're thinking about our place in the world, because inside that circle on the map lives more than half of the people who live on this planet. Right? So it helps to understand, for a place like New Zealand, when we see ourselves and our place in the world, we have lots of connections to lots of different places, and obviously America is one of those, but Asia and its related countries are also important. When you come to New Zealand, you'll find that a lot of people from those places now are coming to our country to live and exist there. And so it's changing the face of the place that we've known as home for a very long period. Just put up, because it's always useful, a few of the stats about New Zealand. I'm not going to run through them detail by detail, but you can see there that we are a place of a lot of differences, really. I mean, from my home in Christchurch, I can take a 10-minute drive and I'm swimming in the sea, or I can take an hour drive the other direction, I could go skiing in the mountains. Right? Or I could just take another hour and a half to that, I'm actually on the other side of the country. I've been to America a few times and I've driven for days and days and days, and I've never seen the sea or the other side of the country on some of those occasions. Right? But coming back to my mihi, there's the illustration that I've got there gives you an idea of what I just communicated to you. So in the top left, my wife and I, my wife over in the corner here, has travelled with me. There we are standing at the top of the hill that overlooks the whole of Christchurch. So in my mihi, I introduce you to ka tihi o kahukura te maunga. Okay, the mountain that's close to me, the one identifier with this is this place called Sugarloaf. Well, we've got our big television aerial transmitter station sits on it. My wife and I climbed up there just last weekend, wasn't it, I think? And we're enjoying a nice sunny spring day. But we've got other places like the river that's shown across on the other side of the screen. I grew up in a house that was right on the bank of that river. It's a river that flows through Christchurch. I went eeling in there, I went whitebaiting in there, I paddled a kayak down there. And for Māori, the river that they were close to was very important. It was the source of their food for many of them. It was a source of a transportation route for trading with others. And so it becomes part of the story, because if you have that said to you, I know that mountain, I know that river. Right? And then, of course, you get introduced to all the other people that are significant in your life. So you can see there my wife and I standing with my 5 children. Steve said this morning, he had that 20 and 4. I can beat that. I've got 17 years between my oldest and my youngest child. Right? And then we've got 6 grandchildren, our mokapuna, who create that full picture. Now, why am I sharing that? Because in the custom in New Zealand, that would help to anchor the thinking in knowing where a person is coming from when they're sharing whatever it is they might want to share with you about. And it's particularly when I talk about those grandchildren, you'll understand, again, thinking about our early keynote speaker about the why, you'll understand that there's a new wave of why has tended to impress itself and make itself important. Now, if I come here, if you came to New Zealand and I asked you, he aha tō mahi, I'd be asking you, what is your job? What is it that you do? And you might reply to me that he kaiako ahau, I am a teacher, I'm an educator. So that word kaiako is the word that translates roughly for New Zealand into English as teacher. But it's an interesting part of that word, ako, the A-K-O, and you'll see this is relevant to my talk, A-K-O. In Māori, there is no word for teaching, just as there is no word for learning. There's one word, ako, means teaching and learning. You can't separate the two. And that's a point that I want to make quite early on in my talk, because I think as we're trying to understand what's going to be meaningful and relevant in our profession and our career and our endeavour as educators as we move forward, is a significant thing is there should, I believe, not be a difference in our minds between teaching and learning, between teachers and learners. We're all in this together, because things are happening at such a pace. The knowledge that we have access to is changing in such a way that we can't afford any longer to think, well, I've been to university for so long, I've done my doctorate, I'm sitting here, I've got my head full of this stuff, I'm ready to pass it on. I'll illustrate a little bit more of that as we go through. So, as we think, I didn't have it, that here we are, he kaiako ahau. Say that to the person next to you. He kaiako ahau. Say it. I can go home a happy man now. My colleagues will be very pleased that I've introduced some Māori language. So we think about what we're doing as teachers, and this is often an impression we have. You know, you sat at these tables this morning, I sat a part of you, and you were challenged about the why, right? And I look at this image here, and I think about, why would I get out of bed each morning and go into a situation teaching young people? What is it that I can carry them forward? And you look at it through their eyes, and it's often quite a different view as it is through your eyes. They're looking at a world ahead. You realise, here we are in 2018, assuming that the life of a child at school is 12 years, it'll be 2030 by the time the kids who are starting school this year are graduating. Now, you don't have to look too far to find literature that's coming out here in the US from OECD and others with their visions for 2030. And many of these groups are painting a picture that's totally different in the world in 2030 to what it is now. And yet that is going to represent the learning life of the young people who are coming into your schools now. And so my challenge that I want to unpack a little bit of today is, how well do you understand what that might be like? And how well do you understand what the impact of that is in terms of the implications, at least, are for what you are doing on that day-to-day basis as the kaiako in your school? Right? I want to move the conversation and suggest that instead of just thinking ourselves as teachers, we think of ourselves as future makers. Those young people who are coming into our schools, who are sitting with us day by day, we are actually creating the future in what we do with them. We can get excited about doing project-based learning. We can get excited about doing play-based learning. We can get excited about different questioning techniques. We can do all this sort of stuff. Why do we get excited about that? It is because we see something about that is preparing our young people for the future that they're going to inherit. And by future makers, there's two sides to that. One is you're investing in those young people to make sure that they're adequately equipped and adequately prepared for the future that they will face. But the other part of it is you are going to be thinking about the future that lies ahead of them, that they will create and make on the basis of their actions. I pulled this picture out a while ago from a Swedish exercise book, a textbook, for 8-year-olds. And in those days, the world was a much simpler place. You're going back about 100 years. And if you were in Sweden and you took the textbook and you read the textbook, you'd say, oh, there's me. I have got a choice. I can either knuckle down, learn my lessons, go forward to a prosperous life, or I can muck around, fail my tests, and end up in the gutter, an alcoholic and a dismal failure. Right? But that's life. You stand at the crossroads while you're at school. I wonder what our drawing might look like if we were to draw that now for the young people who are in our schools. What might we think of as a way of representing what sits on that horizon that I had for those young people earlier on? That is the thing that forms a part of your why. And of course, the key is to understand how significantly our world is changing. And it's changing largely as a result now of the impact of us. Many of you may have read that, over the epochs of history, we have different, we've had the Ice Age and the Stone Age and the Bronze Age, and there are all sorts of fancy, marvelous names that have been given to these ages that we move through history. But many are now referring to the age that is dawning for us as the Anthropocene. Hands up those who have heard of that term. Note it down, the Anthropocene. The key part of the Anthropocene theory is that for the first time in the history of our planet, as far as we know it as human beings, the change that is occurring on our planet is being impacted significantly by us as humans. Whereas in the past, the changes have occurred naturally as a part of what seems to happen to planets and to the solar system and so forth as it emerges. So there's a great deal of interest in this age of the Anthropocene and understanding that what we are doing on a day-to-day basis, the way that we are organising our lives and working together to construct meaning and significance in what we do, is actually having an impact on our planet. And here's one of the things that concerns me as an individual, is that we are polluting our sea, for instance, with so much plastic that they've taken fish from the deepest part of the ocean now and found plastic in its system, in its flesh. Because the thing about plastic is you can't get rid of it. There is no way that plastic decomposes. Once it's created, once it gets into our ecosystem, it's there forever. And yet, you go into our home, into our school, you look at our conference. We've got plastic water bottles, we've got cutlery we make of plastic. It's a daily commodity that we just take for granted. And the question is, what happens when we finish using that? Where does it go? Well, I can tell you where it goes. It goes into our ecosystem in all sorts of ways. It's buried in landfill, it ends up in our oceans, and now it's into our food system. And so when I'm thinking about being a future maker, and I'm thinking about my grandkids, this becomes a significant issue in terms of what I choose to teach about in science, for instance, what I choose to teach about in the social sciences, what we choose to think about as topics or subjects that we might choose for the way that we do our dissertations, our speeches and things, and for the way in which we introduce the idea of research or inquiry to our students. These are authentic contexts that we can look at. One of the jobs that I do in core, we've done it now for about 14 years, is each year we get our staff together and we pull our thinking and our ideas and the research that we're doing and the reading we do and develop these 10 trends. Now, there's nothing particularly unique or magical about them. It's just the fun of the activity and the exercise to develop them. But over the years, it's been interesting to watch the things that we have predicted as they've played out. And so in the middle of the diagram that you're looking at on the board there are the 5 key areas that seem to be a preoccupation of many futures thinkers in terms of the way in which our future is being shaped, in terms of technology, in terms of our structures, the way in which we are looking at the processes that we use, our economic base, and so forth. And so our 10 trends sort of look at the things that are the patterns that are forming. They're not predictions at all, but they're looking at what's happening over time as we are investing time, effort, and energy into this stuff. It was interesting, I was talking to Susan Patrick just down the front before about what we've seen happen in New Zealand around technology and education. And we used to go to conferences 20 years ago and we'd get the workshops happening, excited. Here are the 10 things that you can do with a spreadsheet on a computer, you know, or here are the ways to organize your desktop, or here are the things that you can do to teach language using a word processor. Right? And to some degree, not a lot has changed. I still go to conferences and there are people, here's now the 10 new apps that I've found on the iPad. Here are the new things that you can do with Skype or whatever. Now, whilst those are interesting things that we can preoccupy or occupy our minds and so forth with, and we see that they engage children, they have high levels of interest, the challenge that we need to ask ourselves as educators is, are they actually impacting learning in a deep and meaningful way? Or are they just substitutes for what we used to do in old ways? And if they're merely substitutes, then how could we harness the power of these amazing devices to go deep? I'm going to give you some illustrations and some stories I'll tell in a moment. But in the meantime, if you're, rather than me prattle on for too long about the change in the future, there's a place that you could go to. We've got a plethora of videos and texts and articles and all sorts of things on that site for you to look at. But I want to pick on one thing. Writing. In New Zealand schools, we've had a bit of a shake-up recently. We had the last major shake-up was in 1989, where the government of the day decided that we'd had a very, very long period of time where our schools were being told what to do from the centre. And everyone was getting a bit teed off with this and saying, we're different. We want to do it different. We want to do it our way. And so they hired a very successful supermarket owner to head up a task force to look at the economics of schools and find a different way of operating them. And the result was what they call tomorrow's schools. And overnight, every school in New Zealand became its self-managing and self-operating little entity, like any business is. So they had to elect a board from the local community that operate just like a board of directors on a small business, and that board has responsibility for everything from looking after the buildings through to overseeing the nature of the product that is shipped through, and so forth. And so we've operated like that for almost 30 years. But a couple of years ago, the government responded to a lot of concern that was coming from the education sector and said, the system is stretching a little bit at the seams here, and there's been a change. We need to shift gear a little. And so they introduced a scheme where schools were incentivized, shall I say, to cluster with other schools and to now form little networks of local schools. And the premise of the idea was that it was to focus on the learner. There's an original idea. Let's, instead of thinking about the school and the structure, let's think about the learner. And so what is it that makes the learner unique? Well, the learner starts going to an early childhood centre. moves into an elementary or primary school, onto an intermediate school, onto a secondary school. So what happens if we got all of those schools in the local area together, cluster them together, and incentivise them to look at a connection between their curriculum and their pedagogy and the way that they do that? I think it's a pretty good idea, but I think the way they went around it is terrible. But that's another story for another day. But we are getting there. But one of the things they were asked to do to make that happen was to identify what is it that we've got in common as a challenge when it comes to learning. And they had to use the data that they had in schools about learners, put it on the table and see what they could come up with. Well, I'm surprised that no one could predict it. There were some of us who did. Of course, schools, when you take primary, elementary, intermediate and secondary schools and the nature of the data they capture, certainly in New Zealand, and they put it on the table, there's very limited amount of data that they've got in common. Right? So it came down, we've got lots of data about math, a lot of data about reading, a lot of data about writing, and then not a lot else that's in common. Each school would have its own stuff, not you could compare. And so, miraculously, across all the schools in New Zealand, they started highlighting a very similar need, that actually writing seems to be a problem we've got in common. So writing became the thing we'll focus on. So suddenly, if you were an expert in writing, you were off your feet trying to keep up with the demand from schools to come and help them. I'm being a little cynical there, but the point is that writing, as we look back at it, is a really significant thing in our culture. Right? Many of you probably writing notes as we speak, or intend to write up what you've heard me say after this. Why are you doing that? Because writing is a way that we can record our ideas, we can reflect on them later, but more significantly, we can share them with others. And in that sharing process, we have an opportunity to build knowledge that becomes common to all. We were talking about the ages of the planet. There was quite a lot of agreement that after that initial age where humankind discovered fire, that the next one was really the discovery of language, where we could express our ideas. And writing came much further down the track as a way then of taking that language and recording it in a way that could be shared. And in human history, we can see at the point where writing became a key thing, things flourished across the globe, or certainly in the communities that were connected by travel and so forth at the time. So yes, we can say, put our hand up and say, writing. So what do we do about writing? If we think writing is an issue, what's our why? And what's our future focus about writing? So I just want to take this one little slither of as we go through. We all do poetry in school, don't we? All right? So I'm going to ask you for a moment to read those two poems carefully and see if you can spot any similarities or differences between. What is it about those poems? This is a skim read exercise, so I'll just only give you a few seconds. Right, I don't want to make this a guess what's in the teacher's head type of activity, but I'd be interested if there is anyone who just wants to shout out anything that they saw about those two poems that they find interesting or different or similar. Any observation you make at all. So anyone want to shout out anything? You're allowed to say, I hate it, or I love it. Yeah. You don't like it? Which one, or both? Cool, that's fine. And that's the nature of poetry often, isn't it? It's not the sort of thing that grabs us by the jugular and gets us all excited sometimes. Well, the point about it is this. Basically, one of them was written by a human. The other was written completely by an artificial intelligence. Right? Now, why am I putting this up? Because one of the things when we're thinking about what we've always done in schools is to understand its relevance and significance in terms of that horizon that our young people are looking at. And writing is just one of those areas that is going to be impacted, right? There are papers that you read right now, daily, where a whole lot of the stuff that you're reading hasn't been written by humans at all. It's been written by an artificial intelligence, particularly if you're into sport. A huge amount of sports reporting that you read is not written by humans anymore. It's pretty easy to write sports stuff by an artificial intelligence because there's a whole lot of the key statements made about a game. We know how long the game is. We know where the 20-yard line or whatever it is that you might have in your American football, because I'm an All Black supporter. We have a different feel. But those things are there. And so when someone makes it over the 10-yard line or they make a tackle here, there's a whole lot of common language that gets used over. So if you feed a lot of that into a computer and let it learn from the way things have been written in the past, they can write the reports in the future. That's all that. The other area that is having a huge impact in this is all the economic forecasting stuff. So if you're an economics teacher and you're tuning into a lot of the economic forecasting reports, huge number of those now are written by artificial intelligence, not by humans at all, right? Because it's much easier for them to scan huge quantities of information and just in time, the stuff coming immediately from the stock market, do an analysis and make the prediction, right? How many of you use Wikipedia? Yeah, you're not putting your hands up because you're not allowed to, are you? Because it's crap, it's terrible. But we do, right? And because there's a lot of stuff, there are pros about Wikipedia in that a lot of the articles appear there before they'll appear anywhere else anyway. So if you're looking for current up-to-date information in some areas, it can be a useful resource. But Wikipedia is an example. At the moment, there are robots writing stuff on Wikipedia for you. Anyone like to hazard a guess? How many articles per day at the moment are being written by non-humans on Wikipedia? You can whisper it in your mate's ear. Right? If you said 10,000, you're right. That's a day. 10,000 new articles are going on Wikipedia a day, not even written by humans. So where am I going with all this? Well, the point is that there are a couple of platforms. If you're interested in here, Quill and Narrative Science are the two. You can go and search them, you can look at them, you can play around with them. These are the platforms that have been around for 4 or 5 years now, 3, 4 years anyway, and are being used increasingly by companies. Apple's annual report 2 years ago was published within 2 hours of its annual general meeting, because the artificial intelligence was mapping, monitoring everything that was said. It went right through all the financials, had records, access to all of the records of the Apple Corporation, and pulled it together within that short time frame. So why am I saying this? Well, I'm saying it because we need to understand a little about the impact that some of this technology is having on our world already invisibly. And so for us, back at the chalk face, where we see something like writing as being a priority for our young people, we've got to understand, so why might that be important into the future? And I'm not saying it won't be important. I think there are actually 2 really big significant challenges we need to think about here. One, how and why do we continue to teach writing? And secondly, what are the capabilities that we are building with our young people to be discerning and understanding about the writing that they read, if indeed so much of it is being written by non-humans? How do we understand that from our traditional viewpoint of reliability and validity, for example? But it's not just writing. One more thing before I get into a more positive thing. It's also about how we speak. This is an example, the little recording I've got here, of an interaction between someone who was on a phone call ringing up a help desk, right? Sorry, no, this one actually isn't the help desk one. This one is actually being rung up. You get those pesky calls about dinner time, someone ringing you up, asking you for some advice or whatever. Okay, listen to this. Just press my play.
I'm good, how are you? Well, I'm calling about an online request you once made about health insurance coverage.
Okay.
I work with all major companies and compare...
Hey, are you a robot?
What? No, I am a real person. Maybe we have a bad connection. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, that's crazy. You just sound so much like a robot.
I am a real person. Maybe we have a bad connection. I'm sorry about that.
Will you tell me you're not a robot? Just say I'm not a robot, please.
I am a real person.
I mean, I believe you, but will you just say I'm not a robot? It'll make me feel better to hear you say it.
There is a live person here.
But I know there is. It would just make me feel so much better to hear you say I am not a robot.
What?
If you could say the words, I'm not a robot, it would really mean a lot to me.
And you can figure out where it's going. It's a robot, right? It's a robot. But then if you've rung a help desk at any time in the last while, chances are more than 50-50 now, you've spoken to a robot as well. You haven't spoken to a real person. These robots, you'll notice with that one, there's all the stuff. They've got these artificial intelligences now that work at the other end, that don't just go through a database of responses to questions. They actually listen to your voice. They understand the tension, and they become empathetic to what you're saying. A key area, in fact, I just got it on my phone this morning, it's just been released in New Zealand in a big way, you've had it in America for a while, is Robo Invest. Where now instead of you've got that spare $1 million in your back pocket, you go along and talk to your investment broker, and your investment broker sits and has a conversation with you, and in so doing assesses your appetite for risk and the things that you feel that you do or don't want to invest. You might have a moral objection to investing in anything to do with armament, for example, but you like to invest in things that are there for social or moral purpose. And after a while, your investment guy will say, well, here we are, I think you should invest in these companies. Right? There's your portfolio. So MIT, about 4 years ago, began experimenting with this, and they came and working with an artificial intelligence, came up with a system where you could just make a phone call, talk to the artificial intelligence. The artificial intelligence has access to all the information about places you could invest in, but was specialized in listening to your conversation with it and understanding the tension in the voice when you responded to some of the questions it asked, and so developed a whole case of empathy. And at the end of the day, the hour or whatever it took, would recommend an investment portfolio. And after a year or so of tinkering with us to get it going well, they commercialised it, and it's now out there such that we've got now about 20 companies in New Zealand that are using it and making it available to their clients. And so you find Robo Invest, MIT studies found it 40 times more reliable than a human to give you investment advice. Now, here's the guy who's in charge of the Bank of England. His statements here, he says, you know, we're perhaps underestimating what's happening with all of this. We've yet to see where it might have a big impact. Now, why have I done this? I've led this to the point because for many in the room, it'll make you feel uncomfortable to hear these sorts of things. And I know that you've probably been to conferences in the past where these sort of the shock jock gets up and just spends the whole time talking about this outrageous stuff that's about to come and hit our society and work with us. I've just taken one small slice of something that is, in some people's minds, considered to be likely to have quite an impact, particularly in that 12-year period that our kids are at our school. So that by 2030, most of the predictions about this stuff will be well entrenched. And so our challenge, if we choose to accept, is what do we do? Unless, of course, we're of a mind to say, get away. This is not true. You know, really, there's a lot of ocean. It can do with a lot more plastic being thrown in it. Really? AIs? What happens when the power goes off? Okay. And there are those who support that. We had this reported the other day in New Zealand press. You know, I chose an American example. Right, so you're pretty safe here because it's apparently not going to impact anything for at least 50 to 100 years. Right? So there are people who feel that this is not having an impact. And so that's all right. In our schools, then we just go back to doing what we've done for the last 100 years. But the question is, what happens if it is true? What happens if there is a glimmer of truth in the stuff that we're reading about and hearing about? And this is really where I want to come to. We have to start thinking about what might need to change in our system, not because it's the latest trend or because it's someone's good idea, but because it might be that what we're doing to prepare our young people for the future they're going to face is going to depend on that change happening. Right? That the way that we work currently is not up to it. I think one of the things for me about this is the piece that's on the bottom there that says it's going to challenge us to think about our theory of action. Now that might be something that's quite foreign to some of you, but it's something I'd encourage you to think about very deeply in your schools. And I know that we've got headmasters, principals, district people, superintendents, teachers, all sorts of people. Doesn't matter where you are in the system, you operate on a day-to-day basis with a theory of action. It may be that you don't know what your theory of action is because it's just an implicit thing. You're doing it because you've always done it. Or it may be your theory of action is very explicit. Let me examine 3 examples of theory of action that I think we could have here. The first one is what I call the warm body theory.
Adams.
Here.
Adamley.
Here.
Adamowski. Adamson.
Here.
Adler.
Here.
Anderson. Anderson.
Here.
Bueller. 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 Bueller.
He's sick. My best friend's sister's boyfriend's brother's girlfriend heard from this guy who knows this kid is going with the girl who saw Ferris pass out at 31 Flavors last night. I guess it's pretty serious.
Thank you, Simone.
No problem whatsoever.
Fry.
So the theory of action here is if you turn up and your kids turn up, learning happens. Simple as. If you turn up and your kids turn up, learning's happening. And you think, oh, come on, Derek, did you come all the way from New Zealand to tell us this? This is rubbish. No, think a little more deeply. I was working with some schools in Australia, in Melbourne, a few years back, and these were brand new schools that had just been built. And they'd been operating for a couple of years, but they were fantastic new environments. They'd been built with large open kind of spaces in which all sorts of exciting things were happening. And off these spaces, there were withdrawal rooms, spaces that you could take groups and so forth into. And I was walking through with the architect who had designed them all. And he was talking about how things had evolved in a couple of years since the schools had been built. And I was very fascinated by the fact that he was explaining how, as an architect, he'd had to respond to the requirements of the government at the time in terms of the regulations and the policy work around school buildings. And that determined the floor size that he could build and the size of the rooms. And I was fascinated by the fact that these rooms that were the withdrawal rooms were about the same size as normal classrooms. And yet all the learning seemed to be taking place in this big open space out the middle with some fantastic things happening. I was saying, why were these rooms off the side made so big? Why didn't you design them so they were a bit smaller so that you could have some more intimate learning taking place? And he said, well, that was because one of the stipulations in the regulations was that the rooms had to be that size. They had to be big enough to accommodate a class of students. A class being defined as 25 to 30 students. Right? And he said it puzzled me because that's not the way that things happened when the students came into this environment, and it's not the way the teachers worked. They spend very little time as a whole class in these areas. So he had taken on himself, he tracked it all back to find out why this regulation was in place. And it went back to one line in the regulations that stated that in terms of school buildings, each class had to have a space big enough to accommodate it in which they would assemble each day for the roll to be called. Right? Such is the significance and the importance of the roll call. And of course, any of you who are administrators know that this is the thing that drives our education system. Because if our students are present, we get funded. Right? If our students stop turning up, the money stops. I'd use that illustration to say that whilst you might think that theory of action is absurd, it is a theory of action that's implicit in the way that a lot of what happens in our school system at a policy and resourcing and structural level is supported by. But let's leave that behind. You might think that's a bit much. What about this picture? So this is my empty vessel theory, right? And the theory here is one that's a bit more profoundly linked with the things that we're thinking of education. We say, so the theory here is that knowledge is stuff. It's a noun. Knowledge exists. It's something that you can define and put in boxes. And the mind here is a container, right, into which knowledge can be put and placed, right? And so learning involves the transfer of knowledge from where it exists into this thing called the mind, where it will exist differently. Now, this drawing that's on the wall is about 100 years old as well. And you see there the grinder on the side there is grinding a place where the professor or whoever is putting the textbooks in there. They're being ground up, and then somehow something's being transferred through those wires across and down into the minds of the students. That was the way in which the education was conceived of. It was drawn by a French, I think, illustrator as a conception of the future. Right? And you think, Derek, we're well past that. The question is, are we? Are we? To what extent does the textbook still dominate the way you think about curriculum in your school? To what extent is your examination system determine what is taught and how it's tested? Because the examination system, to a large extent, is purely a measure of how much knowledge transfer there has been. The facts exist over here. Now you regurgitate them. It's made it into your mind. So I put that up as a theory of action that informs still a lot of what happens in our schools. The third one I put up here is what I call the fire to be lit theory. Now, in the fire to be lit theory, we've got the idea that young people are really there as vessels, if you like, that are just potential, really. They have innate ability, they have innate opportunity to learn, they do this thing. And knowledge is not something that's defined, but it's constructed. It's something that emerges through the investigation and the exploration and the connection with others and so forth. And minds are actually not just containers, but they're places of wonder. They're fertile with ideas and opportunities to make those connections. And that learning then is an active process. It has to be participatory. You can't just sit there and wait for the thing to come down the wires and feed your mind. And the image that I've got there is one that I took at a kindergarten in New Zealand about 9 years ago now. Right? And it just fascinated me because it illustrates the fire to be lit. Here are 3 young kids. They found some Slaters under that log. And they were going, their minds were filled with, what are those things? Why do they go in the dark? Why, when we rolled the log over, do they run back in under the log and they don't like to stay out in the sunlight? They had these questions. And they had been brought up in a kindergarten environment where they were very concerned about the environment, so they know that you don't take these Slaters, put them in a jar as a science experiment, leave it on the window over several days until they fry with the sunlight coming in on them. You understand that this is the environment these Slaters are in, that you keep them there. And so they have tools available to them. In this case, it was a laptop, and the thing that the kids got in their hand is a magnifying glass that runs off the laptop. And here they are. They're helping each other. So they're working as a team. Someone's operating the laptop. Someone else is holding the magnifying glass. Someone else is rolling the thing back. And Slaters, they're taking still images. They took those images back later and printed them out, and they coloured them in, and they copied them, and they did all sorts of things with these images, as they might have if they'd taken the Slater and put it into a glass jar. And they went off and they asked questions and they explored, and they did that. These are 4-year-olds. There was no teacher involved at all. They were following the interest that they had. The passion, that desire, and so forth was what drove them. So my question to you is, which of those theories of action most closely aligns with yours? Right? And then, of course, the challenge comes. So if I was to come and visit your classroom, would the espoused theory match your theory in action? I don't want to cast any judgments there. That's the thing you have to ask yourself and be prepared as colleagues to think about. In New Zealand, we had a researcher who has written a book that challenged us a lot about that, and her image is on the screen now. And she wrote here, we're still working within the same 20th century framework. The thinking hasn't changed. It's just couching what we've already done in much fancier production values. It looks cooler, more digitised, but the underlying educational objectives have not changed. That's Dr. Jane Gilbert. And that was the result of her interviewing thousands of teachers, students, and parents in the build-up to her book, Catching the Knowledge Wave. It was written 18 years ago. Right? She's written more recently, suggesting that actually still not a lot has changed. Right? We're using iPads now instead of notebooks, or, physical pads and pens. We're doing things, I like the term, the fancier production values, but has the core meaning of what we're doing changed? And the challenge, of course, is coming back to that little phrase, so what if it is true? What if it really is true that the world is not going to be like the one that we experienced, and we have to think so differently about how we're preparing our young people for it? I've got 3 quick stories I want to tell you. Really, well, they're not that quick, but they are really the substance of what I want to bring. And they represent 3 key principles that I think are at the heart of being an innovative school, an innovative educator, and an innovative learner. 3 things. And I feel like my ideas here have been already repeated a few times in this conference, but it won't hurt to reinforce them. So the first one, I want to tell you the story about a deputy principal in a school in Christchurch that I had on one of the courses that I taught. This is back in the 1990s. Yes, last century, old story, sorry. But it was, this deputy principal did one of my courses which I ran on virtual learning, how you can teach at a distance, and it was all about problem-based learning, authentic learning, all of this sort of thing woven into it. And he'd become pretty keen on that, so much so that he got himself seconded to work for the city council the following year on a project to develop a whole lot of water resources, at least about water. Because in Christchurch, water is a supply. Christchurch was one of only 4 cities in the world where our reticulated water system throughout the city had no added chemicals at all. It was pure as from the artesian wells through snow running off the mountains into the aquifers, and then coming up through and supplying the water. Trouble was, with increased population, water was getting pretty under pressure in terms of its supply. In other words, there wasn't enough snow melting to supply what we were taking away from it. In addition to that, people were clearing away a whole lot of the streams and things, and the foliage that was beside rivers and streams that provide natural barrier to the runoff from roads and things, that meant that water and stormwater was just going straight into rivers, and a lot of our rivers and streams in the city were getting quite polluted. And as a result, we were losing the wildlife and so forth that had normally resided there. And so the city council decided to go on this big effort to think about water and how we could conserve it, how we could protect our waterways and this sort of thing. And this guy went and developed it. Well, in the year 2000, he came back into his school, and I get a phone call from him. And he says, Derek, I've got this class now. It was an inner city school, as multicultural as it came. He had a class of about 26 or 7 students, and there was something like 14 different first languages represented in it. So it was quite an interesting class. They were kind of 9, 10 and 11-year-olds, a composite class, year 3 and 4. And he says, I've got all this stuff. I've spent all last year doing this thing on water. He says, I want to do a unit with my class on this water stuff, but I want to do it like you were telling me about on the course that I did. And I just can't piece it together. I can't think. So I said, I'll pop over and I'll see you. And I sat and after school one day, we sat there and had this planning session. And he had this big box full of all the resources that had been created. And he started a very typical approach, you know, with objectives and lesson 1, lesson 2, and he was thinking about this. And I thought, in my mind I was thinking, he's into the theory of action number 2 here, the empty vessel. He's seeing his students as people who need to learn what's in this box. And so his planning was around how can I sequence and make available what's in this box so that they can absorb it and take it on board. And as we talked and we went around it, it was just like it was a step too far. He just wasn't making sense of this. And in the end, I said to him, look, do you trust me? Yeah, okay. I said, well, I'll come and run the first lesson for you. Would you? Yeah, and I'll write the lesson plan, the unit plan. Will you? Yep, I'll do it. Next Wednesday, after lunch, turned up. Have you got the lesson plan, Derek? Yep. Can I have it? Oh, well, I'll give it to you after the lesson. Okay. He says, right. And so began principle number 1, starting with wonder. Don't start with what you're going to tell them. Start with connecting with where their interest is. What did I do? I walked into the room and I pulled out of my pocket a tap. I picked it up out of my workbench. Just a normal garden variety kitchen tap. And I held it up among the kids. I said, anyone know what this is? Oh, yep. What is it? It's a tap. Oh, now we have a name for this object. That's great. What does it do? Well, water comes out. Does it? No water. Oh, you've got to turn the handle on the top, sir. Oh. Still no water. Oh, but it's got to be against the wall. Oh. No water. And these kids started to fire up with all sorts of suggestions about what I needed to do next to get water to come out of this tap. Now, they innately knew and understood, because they have a bath at night, they have water they get in their kitchen, that water comes out of a tap. But at the point I put it against the wall and no water came out, they started to reach more into the recesses of their thinking. So one kid said, oh, there has to be a pipe in the wall. So tell me what you know about these pipes. And we started a big whiteboarding